I'm going to start off by saying that this was supposed to be a tag team presentation between myself and David McCorkindale, but he is unfortunately for us, but also fortunately at the same time, he's in Ottawa right now at very important COSEWIC meetings, and we're going to talk a little bit about the work that he was doing, and I'm going to present a couple of his slides this evening. I thought what we would do when I usually do these talks, I like to talk a little bit about something unique or something that the group would not necessarily know. So I'm not really going to be talking to you guys about wild bee association and wildflowers, because clearly that's something that you could probably educate me on, in particular about the flora of Nova Scotia. So I'm taking a unique twist to this, and we're going to be talking about how important wild bees are to agriculture and how important it is to have particular habitats in our agricultural system. And that's a really important thing, particularly in Nova Scotia. And I think you'll see why when I go through the presentation. But I wanted to start off by really showing you how many bee species, wild bee species we have in Canada, and in particular the Maritimes and Nova Scotia. We like to, a lot of the information, I should say, that we know about pollinators, a lot of it stems from our use of honeybees. And we actually have in Canada over 925 different species of wild pollinators. And in Nova Scotia, the last count was 235 different species of wild pollinators. We have quite a few here. And you can see on my map of Canada, the dark red spots are the biodiversity hotspots for wild bee populations. So Southern Ontario has just over about 400 different species, and the prairies here tend to have a lot of species as well. This map was produced by Dr. Corey Sheffield, who is the curator at the Royal Museum of Saskatchewan, but he's a fellow Nova Scotian, born and raised, and he's from the Valley. And I would consider him to be Canada's wild bee expert. And he's one of the individuals who trained me on identifications. And he produced this map in 2011. So it's out of date. We know that we have far more species than we're reporting. And it's very important to continue to do the monitoring that we're doing to really understand our wild populations. And what this pie chart actually represents is the proportion of nesting substrates for our wild species that we have in Nova Scotia. And the 34%, the blue here, actually represent the proportion of bees that nest solitarily in the ground. So 34% of the species that we find in Nova Scotia nest in the ground, and 17% of them are actually social, so they nest together in the ground. So together that makes up just over half of our population are ground nesting bees that we find here. That's really, really important, and you'll see why in a little bit. We have about 21% of our bee species are cavity nesting bees, so they nest in stems of our pithy plants, and I am going to highlight some plants that are important. So what are bees exactly? I get asked that question a lot. What are, a lot of people will say to me, oh, it's a honeybee, it's a honeybee. No, actually, bees are considered to be furry wasps. They're the first cousin to a wasp. Some sting. A lot of females will sting, but they don't hurt. They often get a bad rap because of a lot of misinformation that is out there. So as I said to you, a lot of species are actually nesting in the ground. And in fact, this is a diagram of a very common ground nesting species from Ontario. And you can clearly see on the side of the image that I have here, the depth of the nest of this particular species. And this species is called the squash bee, and it's very important for pollinating our squashes and our watermelon species that we have in Canada. And what I'm highlighting this because I want you to pay attention to that number. And if, for those of you who can see me on the side here, what I want to point out to you is that 18 centimeters is about the size of our phones, right? So we're not talking a deep nest. They're not found very deep from the surface. And that's really, really critical, particularly in agricultural areas where we're doing a lot of heavy management, a lot of tilling, a lot of really moving the soil. When we're that close to the top, we could be doing a lot of damage to the particular nests. And here in this picture, I have some images of cavity nesting species that you will find in Nova Scotia. This one is a cavity nester. It's Ceratina calcarata, and you can see it here just coming out of the cavity. And this is what you'll find of the cavity of the stem of the plant that it likes to nest in. And what it does is that it will stuff the lining of the stem or the twig, depending on what species of plant it's actually nesting in, with its pollen and nectar. It will have its larvae there, and then it'll actually put up a partition of mud, and it repeats itself throughout the cavity. And like I said, there's over 24% of our wild species that we find in Nova Scotia actually do this in different areas. And 21% of our species that we have are those cavity nesting species. Now, the other important one, sorry to be jumping around here, is this one. The 17%, as I said, are actually nesting together. So what that means is they're sharing a nest. So there's not just one individual that's found in the nest, there's multiple. And they, a lot of them tend to be halictid species, and they often are very similar to this guy, which is the orange-legged furrow bee, Halictus rubicundus, which is very commonly found everywhere in Nova Scotia. And a lot, like I said, a lot of different species are social, and they will dig nests together, and they will live somewhat semi-social in their nesting substrates. The other group of it, obviously, is our truly social bees, which is our bumblebees. And they have a very unique way that they tend to live. They live obviously in with a queen and workers, which are all females, and the queens will start to nest and stay and lay the workers for storage, for their worker bees for forage, and protect the queen and their young. The males tend to die off in the season and mate prior to actually dying. And bumblebees, as I said, are by far the most common example of this particular group of eusocial insects. And they're very, very, very important in our wild populations. But probably the most important in healthy bee communities is our kleptoparasites. And our kleptoparasitic species, this is a very common one that we find here in Nova Scotia, very different when we look at this guy in comparison to the rest, and we can clearly see that his abdomen is pointed, and it's one of the most defining characteristics of this particular group is the pointy abdomen. And what happens with kleptoparasitic species is they tend to lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, and they take the pollen for themselves, and they put it in protective areas. So they literally, their common name are robber species for very, very good reason. In comparison to bumblebees and in comparison to the social and solitary ground nesters, the other defining characteristic of these guys is they tend to have less hair. So, you know, the bumblebees are very hairy. They have lots of branched hairs. where these guys don't have a lot of hair, and they have a very thick exoskeleton in comparison to the species that they tend to actually rob their nests of, rob their nests of. And I want to point out some of our unique species that we actually have here in Nova Scotia. And I want to start off with this one. We do have an endemic species to Nova Scotia, and it's the Sable Island sweat bee. And it was considered by COSEWIX in 2015 to be threatened. It's endemic and restricted, obviously, to Sable Island. So there's it's a very endemic species, and it's restricted to Sable Island, and it's a ground nesting species. And what's really interesting is that this species is probably no bigger than the nail on your pinky finger. It's very, very tiny. And again, keep in mind that the nest that it's building is probably no deeper than 18 centimeters from the top, the surface. And it's very, very a unique species to study, particularly with climate change, because it's so used to a lot of hard and harsh weather conditions at Sable Island in comparison to a lot of other species. So we look to this species to really understand thermal tolerances of our bee species that we have on the mainland, and how bees can actually survive changing sea levels, the introduction of non-native species, and high winds. This is one of the species that we look towards because it has survived for a long, long time there. The image here is of Dan Keller from Parks Canada and Dr. Miriam Richards from Brock University in Ontario. And Dr. Miriam Richards is considered to be the expert on this particular group. And she went to Sable Island in July of 2019, looking for the nests on Sable Island of this particular sweat bee. And so she spent hours. You can see the little flags that she has on the ground, and that's to determine where the nests are, where those little holes are with the turrets coming out of the ground. And she was able to get some really good data to provide parks some management implications on the sweat bee. So here's a closer look at it. And as I said, the field work was sponsored by Parks Canada, and it was really to understand where it's distributed across Sable Island and really get a good understanding of where it's nesting, look at its social behavior and how it's actually adapting to changing conditions with climate change and with things that are happening on Sable Island. And you can see one of the defining characteristics of this group, Lasioglossum, they have this metallic sheen to them. So if you ever are fortunate to see a Lasioglossum species up close, you will see that most Lasioglossum do have that metallic sheen across them. Now this is kind of jumping around, I'm sorry. The other interesting and rare species that we have here in Nova Scotia is the Macropus cuckoo bee. And it's a very, very rare bee. It used to be very widespread. It was found all over Nova Scotia, but now it's very difficult to find this. The cuckoo bee is a parasitic bee, so it is a kleptoparasitic species. So it does lay its eggs in the nest of a host species, and the host species for this particular species is called Macropus nuda. And the host actually requires an oil producing plant, and many of which those plants are actually found in a lot of moist habitats throughout Nova Scotia. And that's important because then we can hone in on where to actually look to see where this species is. But what's interesting is that the host requires the oil producing of the particular plant, but the host nests in dry soil conditions, right? So it's interested in the oils of a plant species that's found in moist conditions, but the habitat that the host of this particular species, this bee species is going for, is dry, right? So again, that's really narrowing down where we can look for these particular species. And the more information that we know, the more we can find. And the first person to find it was Dr. Corey Sheffield from the Royal Museum in Saskatchewan. And he found it in 2002, but it was listed by COSEWIC in 2018. The other species that's really unique in Nova Scotia, and that is threatened, is the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee. So again, cuckoo meaning the kleptoparasitic species, the species that require another species to lay its eggs in the nest of. And it was designated endangered in 2014. And it was last seen in Nova Scotia probably around 2002 in the Kentville area. And it was also seen in Georges River here in Cape Breton. Now, the reason it was seen in Georges River is because that's where Dr. McCorkindale lives. And he was actually looking for it pretty hard, and he found it. And that brings up the important point of how important monitoring is for species, because when we're out looking for things, we tend to have more success in actually finding it. So the Bohemian cuckoo bee was actually listed by COSEWIC in 2020, and it depends on its hosts quite a bit, as I said. And it was perceived actually to be doing very good away from where people were living. But the surveys that we have on this particular species are very limited. Are very limited, and we need to be doing more of that work. The other species that I want to introduce you to is Bombus turricula, and it was listed as a species of special concern in 2015. This species, Bombus turricula, is the common name is the yellow-banded bumblebee. And for clear reasons, you can clearly see on its abdomen here that it has a very, very strong yellow band across its abdomen. And what was interesting about the yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus turricula, is for a long time, this bumblebee was actually so common that it was used in the behavioral ecology lab at Cape Breton University because it was so widespread, and we could find it absolutely everywhere. And to think now it is listed as a species of special concern is pretty, pretty staggering. And I want to show you the map that was produced in the COSEWIC report in 2015. This is the global range, or the North American range, of that particular bee, the one that was used in the behavioral ecology lab because it was so commonly found. What you can see, the gray dots on this map, are the historical records that with the collection, so everything that was before 2004. The red dots are where the species has been located between 2004 and 2014, and you can clearly see how significant the population has declined across North America, and how very few dots we are finding in this particular for this particular species. Now, moving on a little bit, now that you know a little bit more about the different species that we have, how they're nesting, I want to talk about what makes a pollinator very effective. And it's the branched hairs that a pollinator has, and they're very, very important for moving the pollen from one area of the flower to the other. And you can clearly see on the two photos that I have here, the pollen is being collected on the thorax here and the head of this particular species. And then this megachile species, this cavity nester, has a lot of branched hairs on its abdomen, and it's collecting pollen and moving pollen in two completely different ways, but very, very important. And this species you can see here is collecting the pollen and moving it on its legs. This species is Halictus ligatus. It's a social ground nesting species that's very commonly found, not only throughout Nova Scotia, but it's probably the most common wild species that is associated with agricultural crops in North America. Moving on now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we actually know about what's impacting our wild species in North America. And I'll touch a little bit on my work and what I have been doing. And this is probably, in my opinion, one of the most important images that I present. And it's bug splatter on a windshield. And when I started doing my research over 15 years ago, I was working in an agricultural field, and an individual said to me, well, you know, I don't really necessarily believe in climate change because I put things in the ground, I put crops in the ground, and I get something year after year. Some years are better than others. And so I really shook my head and I didn't understand how we were going to really communicate the loss of our pollinators to this individual. And it occurred to me that the one language that we both understood was bug splatter on a windshield. So I went back to this individual and I said, when was the last time that you cleaned bug splatter off your windshield? And that individual said, I don't know, actually. And I said, that's biodiversity loss. So this is a very important and impactful image, because this is something that my kids will never understand. And we will not be seeing this again because we're losing so many insects and so much biodiversity loss on a, you know, not only on a global scale, but on a provincial scale and a federal scale as well. And that's a really, really significant thing, particularly when we're talking about food security and we're talking about how important our wild bee species are. As I said, when I started this group knows full well the importance about pollination when it comes to wildflower diversity. So I wanted to take this opportunity to educate you on how important wild bee species are for the agricultural sector as well. And this study was actually published in Science in 2013. And it's a very important study because it was looking at how wild bee species did in pollinating our common crops across the world in comparison to the honeybee. And you can see with the red square that I have here, there's a lot of crops that were looked at in this study are from North America. And not only were they from North America, they were from northeastern North America. So very important to this part of the world, very important to things that we need to eat. And what the take-home message of that study is I want to show you here on the x-axis, I have some of our crops highlighted. We have cherry, we have strawberry, we have watermelon, we have blueberry, our blueberry industry in Nova Scotia. We have sunflower, we have red clover, pumpkin, tomatoes. Again, we have cherry and some cucumber, all here. So very, very important to Nova Scotia, those particular crops. And then these dots, what the take-home message is the red dots are wild pollinators in comparison to our honeybees. And you can clearly see that in every crop that they looked at, our wild species pollinated the flower of that particular crop better. They did a better job than our honeybee species that we rely on for for pollination. Now, I don't want to give the honeybee a bad rap. There's a good reason why we rely on our honeybee, and I want to show you how important our honeybees are to our agricultural sector. And this does a really good job. So this is where I'm located. I'm here in Sydney. This is my red dot. And what I have here are the foraging distances of our bee species. And that's why we rely on the honeybee for our agricultural reasons. This first circle that I have here is the foraging distance of our solitary bees. So as I said to you when we started this meeting, our solitary species that make up just over half social and solitary of the species that we find in Nova Scotia are actually foraging less than 1 kilometer from their nests. And typically, they're actually only flying probably 500 to 750 meters from their nest. So really, really small local scales is where the majority of our wild species are actually foraging. Now, our bumblebee species are my second circle here, and they fly about 1 to 2 kilometers from their nests. So a little bit, their body size is a little bit bigger, so they can withstand a lot more weather conditions, and they particularly wind, and they can fly a lot further. And you can clearly see here from Sydney, well, Sydney, this is Cape Breton University. And then this is the radius that I have of the honeybee. And on a good day with good weather conditions, from Cape Breton University, a honeybee could fly to New Waterford from Cape Breton University. It can fly probably 8 to 10 kilometers is what the literature is reporting. Now, that's not to say that they all do that, but that's what has been reported in the literature, that they can fly. So they're flying a really great distance in comparison to a lot of other species. And that's important when we have large scale agricultural crops that we have to pollinate. So there is a need for this because the agricultural systems have been so large. And as I said, this is not to give the honeybee a bad rap, but it's to really show the difference in the scale that we're talking about, that these wild species can fly in comparison to our managed population, which is significant in comparison. Now, why pollination is so important and why the title in my position is called food security, this is because of this photo. Without bees, we would have very, very little to eat. I have on the left here an image of what our diets look like with pollination, both with our wild species and our managed species. So we have our watermelon, we have our apples, we have our squashes, we have our berries, we have all kinds of our field fruits and vegetables that are there. And without our pollinators, on the right, that is what our diets are going to look like. So this is a major food security issue, is pollination. You can see we're going to have potatoes and corn, and I hope everyone likes mushrooms, because that is what our diets are going to look like, and maybe a little bit of pineapple you can see in the corner. So we're going to have all of our species that are not necessarily need that special movement of the pollen from one end of the flower to the other. And that's going to be really drastic. And you can clearly see here what happens particularly to our blueberry industry in Nova Scotia. When we have pollinators in our fields, we tend to produce better yields. And when we don't, and our pollinators are excluded, or the weather conditions are bad, and we're seeing more and more of that, particularly in the spring. We're seeing a decline in our berry productions, and we're seeing in all of our fruits and vegetables, really. And this photo really does a good job in showing that decline and how our yields are going to be significantly impacted over time. And I like to point out to people why pollination is so important. It's not just our fruit and vegetable industry that really has taken note with this. It's our dairy industry as well. And our dairy industry has really taken note of the lack of pollination and the lack of wild pollinators, because cattle feed on alfalfa, and alfalfa is pollinated by bees. So without alfalfa in our feed for our cattle industry, this is what the dairy section of our grocery stores are going to look like if we're not paying attention to what we're doing to our wild pollinators over time. A colleague of mine, Alexandra Klein, in 2007 actually wanted to quantify and look at to see how many bites of food we take is because of pollination, and what crops are actually particularly important or rely on pollination. And she quantified on a global scale that 35% of the global production is depending on some sort of pollination, so some sort of pollinator. And what that actually equates to is 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we take is because of pollinators. That is a really important stat when we're talking food security. And you can see here the image that I have is that I wanted to highlight how dependent particular crops are. So to really drive home the point of how important they are to our agricultural industry and also to our wild species that we have, floral species that we have in Nova Scotia. So when we're talking canola oil, it's about 25% loss without our wild species of bees that are present or associated with that agro ecosystem. And then we have raspberries that in 2007, it was really argued between 40 and 90% of that crop was dependent. And now I can tell you today that a lot of people would actually say it's 90%. It's completely dependent almost on the presence of a wild species for that pollination. And things like kiwis were considered to be a high dependency crop. So something that we really needed pollination for. We obviously don't grow pollination. We don't grow kiwis here in Nova Scotia. So I wanted to really drive home the point of how important it is for this particular industry in Nova Scotia and how important those wild species are that we talked about. Without our wild species in Nova Scotia, these are the crops that we are going to lose. And this is where our agricultural industry really needs to step up and to understand the importance of pollination in the face of climate change. Without our pollinators, we are going to lose our apple industry, our watermelons, our squashes, our pumpkins, our cherries, our pears, our peas, our raspberries, our blackberries, and our tomatoes. That's our entire diet. And this is how important wild bee species and pollinator dependency in particular crops are in Nova Scotia. And so interestingly enough, when I was being introduced, it was discussed about the report that I wrote for the province of Ontario. And the province of Ontario asked me when I was doing my postdoctoral degree to actually summarize where our information was coming from. And what I want to point out to you in this particular photo is the information that we have from Canada and the US and Europe about what's pollinating our crops. And I'm going to just show you here with these bars, our field fruits and vegetables. So the ones that I just had on the particular slide that were so important in Nova Scotia and the crops that are dependent on wild bee species. We have no information of wild bee species being associated with our field fruits and vegetables from Canada. And this was published in 2017. There was no published information of any of our 934 species being associated with particular field fruits and vegetables. That's not the berry industry that we have information from the berry industry, but our field fruits and vegetables are completely lacking. And this is another graph that I wanted to point out. We have a lot of information from North America on the apple and the blueberry industry, but we're really lacking information on a lot of other industries, particularly the tomato industry, particularly the cucumber. And these are the areas that we really have to start to target, particularly because of how our wild solitary ground nester species are living. And what this actually works out to, that graph, when we look at it for the Maritimes, this is what, and we look at those particular categories, we really have no information for our field fruits and vegetables right here. The crops that are highlighted here in red are the crops that we really have to look at. You know, we have a lot of information that's coming out about the apple and the blueberry and our cranberry and raspberry, but we really have to start to really look at our field fruits and vegetables and understand the association of our wild species in those particular areas. And there are certain things that we can do. that not only the agricultural industry can do, but what we can do, particularly in our own backyards. A lot of individuals don't really realize that pollinators are what are called trichomats. So they can only see 3 colors. So bees tend to see everything from the yellow spectrum down. So they don't see red. They don't see they can't see those colors. And that's really, really important when we're trying to increase the presence of our wild species in particular areas, because what we want to plant to enhance the pollination around our crops is the particular wildflowers that grow in Nova Scotia. And planting anything that's ornamental for us, that's red, is not beneficial at all to our wild species because they can't see it at all. And this is really, really important because this gives a really good perspective of what bees can see when they look at flowers. And it's not only bees, it's other insects as well. When we look at a flower, we tend to see it one way, and the bees see it as a lot of nutrients all in one spot. And that's the take-home message in this particular image, is how important it is to really look at what we're planting and what we have naturally growing, and how we can actually increase that and encourage that, because what we have naturally growing is a lot easier for pollinators to have a relationship and to pollinate a particular plant. And one of the reasons for that is for petals. So in my particular field, we refer petals as landing strips. So landing strips are the petal is going to actually guide the insect to the nectar and the pollen source. And that's really, really important. So again, from the bee's perspective, what we can't see is the ultraviolet images and the actual shading of the petals. And that is actually used to guide the insect to the reward, which is in the center of the flower or the plant species that we have. And I often use this in a lot of particular talks to really drive home the point to a lot of gardeners and a lot of people that aren't necessarily familiar with particular plants. When you're planting a plant like this in your backyard, and I say your backyard because a lot of people will say, no, Alana, I don't have anything. I don't have any wild species living in my backyard. And I say, remember, wild species are not flying far from their nests. They're flying 400 to 750 meters. So 9 times out of 10, your backyard is an ecosystem as well. And we all have a part to do. And planting things like this is not really going to be a reward for pollinators in comparison to this over there. Again, very easy for the pollinator to get into, very easy for the pollinator to get the reward. And when we're talking in an agricultural system, this is the plant that we tend to look to because it's providing habitat, it's providing food for the particular species, and it's allowing the species to get into the middle of the crop, which is important in the agricultural areas. The thing that's really cropping up, and I'm sure members of this society are thinking, oh my God, I can't believe we're talking about a dandelion. But it's a really important thing because it is considered to be one of the first foods that a lot of wild bees are seeing in our backyards. And if it means providing our species with more food and more resources to allow for more wild diversity to be encouraged in particular areas, then I'm all for it. And the message for this, with a lot of growing groups and a lot of community groups, is that we need to encourage people in Nova Scotia to be thinking of the season, not just July and August, and planting species for when we're on vacation. It's to really look at from April and May all the way to October. And I know that this group is very, very, very familiar with asters, and they're probably the most important wild floral species for our wild pollinators, because it's at the tail end of their season and they still need that food in October. And that's it's very, very important to encourage. So this is probably the biggest no-no when we are talking about what we can do for our wild pollinators. As I said, they can't see this. This is completely just for us. And I often say to a lot of people, please think about putting your wild blueberries into a container and actually planting them, so we can encourage our pollinators to come into our yards a little bit more. And the other thing that we can really do is start to really look at our nesting substrates that we have in our own backyard. This is a very beautiful backyard from my perspective, because it has a lot of open ground patches. And this is very, very important for our wild bee species to move into our backyards. And this is a rodent burrow that I found in Bedford, of all places, in someone's backyard. And you can see how important it is for our bumblebee species that is nesting there. And then again, we have to start to encourage our cavity nesting species. You can see the species here that's nesting in this particular pithy stem. This plant, a lot of species will be nesting in early stages of the springtime. And so trimming anything in our backyards is something that we do not want to do, because we're actually eliminating the nesting substrates of a lot of our cavity nesting species that we have here. I took this image that we have here at the top just off of Google. And a lot of people will say to me, Alana, I went to Home Depot and I bought a bee hotel and I put it in my backyard and I'm helping. You do not have to do that. And in fact, a lot of the time when those are actually encouraged, it can create a lot of habitat for wasp species that we do not want to encourage. We still have to do a lot more research about the impacts of putting these bee hotels. And so the image that I have on the bottom there is of just a typical hydrangea plant that you would find in someone's backyard. And I encourage more people, that is better than to spend the money. And you can clearly see the prices that are listed there, than putting those in your backyard to encourage pollinators to go in. Because 9 times out of 10, you're also going to be encouraging the wasp species to move in. And then on a little bit of a larger scale, a lot of things that we encourage is to really pay attention to south and southeast facing property, particularly in obviously agricultural areas, because that's really important for nesting and mating sites. And I have an image up here of rocks. Very important for ground nesters. A lot of ground nesting species that I presented at the beginning like to nest under the rocks because it's a safer area for them. And that makes a lot of sense when their nests are not any deeper than that, the depth of a typical iPhone. So they need that substrate. The other thing is that we really have to start thinking about our leaf litter in our yards and how important it is. We're seeing a huge discrepancy with our plant pollinator interactions, not only in our agricultural systems, but we're seeing it all over. And without a deep winter snow and snow on the ground for a long time, we're seeing a lot of species that are emerging earlier, and there's not a lot of wildflowers there to actually give the pollinator the food that it's requiring. So we're seeing this disconnect between our floral resources and our pollinators. So keeping leaves on the ground are important for their perspective because it's the only insulation that they have left. When we have dry winters and we have wet winters in terms of rain and not particular snow, as I said, for that insulation, the leaf litter that we have on the ground is the only thing that these species have left to keep them keep them in the ground. This is a really important study too when we're talking about our backyards and what we can do to encourage our wild species to stay. A lot of our common techniques that we use in our backyards are actually very detrimental, and one of them is actually mulch. So when we put mulch down in our flower beds around our yards, we're actually really discouraging our pollinators from getting into it. And if you think about it, it's very difficult for a species that, as I said to you, is no bigger than your pinky finger to actually move the mulch away to be able to get into the ground and to be able to establish a nesting site. So one of the things we like to encourage people is to not really rely on our common garden techniques that we used, and really look at what we're planting and how we can plant in our own backyards and encourage more wild species that you would find in particular areas. We've had a lot of success in the most recent years of encouraging and engaging the public. The South End Community Garden here in Cape Breton is a very, very big success story for as an outreach and an educational area to educate people on what we can use in our backyards instead of the most common species. And there's been a huge uptake. And there was a recent study that was completed by the Canadian Wildlife Society across Canada, and 38% of Canadians, after they were told how important pollinators were, not only for our wild floral species, but for our agricultural system, were interested in having their taxes increased if it meant to make sure that these species were conserved and there was policy in Canada to protect them. So that, I think that's a really important thing to get across, and obviously really allow nature to come into our backyards and to really encourage things instead of relying on the most manicured ways. And one thing that I've been really an advocate for, this is a beautiful garden just outside of Toronto, but what's interesting about it is that this is in the front. This is not in the back of the home. This is in the front of the home. And this is something that we really have to encourage society to start thinking about and thinking about putting these particular plants in our front yard. So we can not only make sure that we're food secure ourselves, but so are our neighbors. And there's been a huge uptake in the literature when children are educated on how plants and fruits and vegetables are grown, the more they tend to not be picky eaters, and they tend to eat more when they can see the actual species growing themselves. So I just want to finish off by saying that bees are absolutely everywhere. They're not just in wild areas of Nova Scotia. They're everywhere. They're in our backyards. They're in our agricultural areas. They're located everywhere. And the services they provide, not only to our wild species, but the services they provide to our agricultural system is for free. And that we really have to start thinking about the flowers and the shrubs are providing two services: their habitat and they are food, and that our wild species are our agricultural pollinators too. And we really have to start thinking about our management practices that are happening there on a larger scale for our food security. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Well, thank you, Alana. Let's just stop the sharing here, and there we go. There we go. That was really interesting. And I think we should probably take some questions. Are any questions?
Well, one question I have about the mulch is in your photo, that sort of looked like bark mulch or something. What about straw? That would still be easy enough, I would hope, that the insects could get through it.
Right. So you're correct. It would be a lot easier for species to move the straw and to get into the ground that way. The other thing is straw is a lot lighter than the mulch is. So in a bee's perspective, the mulch is like moving a boulder. So the straw, they're used to moving twigs, they're used to moving leaves, a lot of them to nest, to line their nests with. So they can easily move the straw in comparison to the mulch.
Good. Thanks.
I have one question for you, which is, how does the population vary over the course of the season? Like I certainly think I see more pollinators as the season progresses. Is that in fact the case?
So in fact, it's not. We actually have more species in Nova Scotia that emerge in the springtime than we do that emerge in August. And that's one of the reasons why our agricultural industry, our blueberries and our apples do so well in Nova Scotia, is because we have more species that emerge in the spring than we do later in the season. Springtime in a lot of places actually in Canada, there's a lot of more spring bees than there are in the later season. Yeah. So, but what you're probably seeing is the male species and the worker bees that tend to come out looking for food to bring back to the nest, getting ready for winter. So, and a lot of the times in fairness, there's a small group of us that are really paying attention to what's emerging in April and May because we're paying attention to the particular species. Most people really tend to hone in on species when it's a little nicer, when it's warmer, the conditions are a little better. But no, we have more spring emerging species than we have in the later part of the season.
I mean, it may also be because of what I'm growing and what flowers are attracted to in that,
Yeah. And that's it. As I said, a lot of the wild species that we have, they're not flying more than 300 to 750 meters from their nest, and it's species dependent, right? So it's size dependent. It's what they're going for their food and where their nests are. So yes, all of those things are really play an important part. And the other thing, too, that's important that I didn't touch on, and I should have, and I apologize for it, is wind conditions. A typical, July day in Nova Scotia is anything over 35 kilometers an hour is considered a lovely day, in Nova Scotia.
Sorry, it just dropped out there again.
Okay. I have some bumblebees with a very colorful abdomen. They have a red and yellow stripe.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be the tricolor?
I don't know. I would have to, if you can take a photo of it in the spring and send it to either Dr. McCorkindale or myself, I would be happy to look at it. A lot of the time, it's very difficult to identify bees without really having a good image of it. And so technically, until we really see the color bands and how many of the color bands there are, it may or may not be that species. So if you can take a photo of it and send it, then I can give you a little bit more of a concrete answer than that.
I think it moves faster than I do, but I'll try.
They do. It is an art.
And where do white flowers like daisies fit into the color scheme?
So that's really interesting. So bees and a lot of insects, as I said, they're trichomats. So they tend to hone in on particular colors: blues, violets, yellows, and whites. And when you think about it and you think about nature, that's what we see, right? Those are the typical colors that we have in nature. So when we're actually collecting them and we're using pan traps, so we use these plastic bowls that we put a little bit of water in particular areas to collect them. We use those colors. We use white, we use blues, and we use yellows for that particular reason, because it mimics what those species would find in nature. So yes, they can see white.
Alana, I wanted to ask you a question. I really enjoyed your talk. With the graphs that you show with the drop in the populations over the years, is our agricultural sector really aware of the concern of this? Do they wonder where, it's quite serious, really.
Yeah, it is. Yes and no is the answer. There are particular people in the agricultural sector that are very aware of this and are doing everything in their power to encourage wild pollinators. And then we have a lot more work to do to really get the message across and to really understand how important our wild pollinators are for our agricultural sector.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about what you call the managed pollinators, like the honeybees, and how they're used for pollinating crops? And are these the species that the hives are kind of transported from one field to the other, kind of thing?
They are, in fact, managed pollinators are anything that we've, manipulated, for our well-being. So the honeybee is one, a managed pollinator that we would consider. Bumblebees, one particular species, Bombus impatiens, is a group that we have managed and we use for agricultural population. And there are some cavity nesting species that we've started to really look at. Particularly in the States, not a lot here in Canada. We tend to rely on either bumblebees or honeybees. And the reason for it is because they're social. They do communicate with each other. They do tell each other where there is a food source. So when you think of it in terms of pollinating large fields, when they are released, they communicate with one another where the food source is, and then they go, they can do the pollinating that way. But yes, a lot of species are moved around. We have more regulation in Canada about limiting the movement of particular hives from one area to the other than the United States has. And the implications for that, obviously, is that it can spread a lot of pests and pathogens and a lot of viruses. There was a study that was completed by a colleague of mine, Dr. Sheila Kola. She's at the York University. She was looking at the impact of managed populations of Bombus impatiens when they're released in greenhouses to do, our tomato pollination in Southern Ontario. And what her study was to look at the pathogen load at different radii around the greenhouses. So right around it, then, 50 meters, and then 150 meters, and then a kilometer. And she was finding viruses that were spread in the greenhouses from pollinators up to a kilometer away from the greenhouse. So what's happening is these managed species that are let loose in greenhouses are getting out through the ventilation system of greenhouses, and they're really impacting our wild pollinators and also our floral resources as well.
Okay. So in that way, they're leading to a decrease in the wild species. They're hurting. They can hurt the wild species populations.
Well, absolutely. So one of the things that a lot of wild bee experts in Canada are starting to really look at is what type of viruses and pathogens we're finding in our wild species that are from our managed. And, when you think about it, in terms of the lessons that we came out of, well, I shouldn't say came out of, because we're still in COVID, but the lessons that we've learned is to stay 6 feet apart, don't go near each other when we're sick, and really contain ourselves. Well, think about it, when a managed pollinator that's social coughs on itself and then is allowed to release itself, it is going to be spreading a lot of diseases. And it's something that we, really have to concern ourselves in our agricultural sector as well.
Thanks.
Alana,
Yeah.
thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if there are resources you would recommend if we want to learn to plant for pollinators.
Interestingly enough, there's not a lot of resources for the Maritimes. And that's one of the things that I am working on, is to really develop a guide of what is important to plant in our backyards to encourage our pollinators for communities. The NAPSI Society, so the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, is one place that I would direct you to. They have zone guides for different areas of North America. Some are into Canada, and some of our zones are pretty similar. They have really interesting species to plant. So I would, that are clearly native, by the way, not encouraging anyone to plant invasives, but to really get an idea and of the proportion of different colors and of, shrubs in comparison to flowers and that sort of thing. I would direct you to NAPSI and also to the Xerces Society. They have really good information as well for those types of things.
Another question I had for you was on the bug splatters.
Yeah.
So I gather from what you're saying is that you would expect to see a reduction in bug splatters over time in most areas. Is anybody sort of quantified that, or? Did we just lose Alana? I think we did. We're having a bad day on the internet here.
Hi, I'm so sorry. My internet just dropped right off.
I'm glad we got you back. I don't know what's going on today, but there seems to be a bad day for internet.
It is.
I think the other problems are on my end, to be honest, from the way it was acting. But can't remember. There was a question just as we lost you, and I don't remember what it was now.
The last thing I heard was a question about the windshield.
Okay, that was me, I guess. So I just was curious about whether there's anybody's really quantified these bug splatters over time, and it's certainly something I think we've all kind of noticed, but what has anybody really studied that?
So there have been some studies, particularly in the US, none in Canada, that have looked at changes in biomass over time. And basically how that is completed is we set up malaise traps. And we look at, the jar of bugs that is collected over, an extended period of time and then over many years. And the take home message for that is that the biomass, so how much of it that we're seeing in these traps over time is getting far, far less. So yeah, that's where that is coming from.
Is a lot of that being linked to the neonicotide? Is it those pesticides?
So it's a lot of things. Agrochemicals is one. There's no question about it, particularly the seed treated neonic crops that we're planting. That's a really big part of it. The other issue that is causing a huge decline in our species is the pests and pathogens from our managed species. So the viral loads that we're finding in our wild species are just not something that they're used to. So that's another important factor that's causing a decline. Habitat loss is a major one, particularly for species that aren't flying very far. So, these huge urban sprawl developments are really causing a huge decline. And so are the size of our cropping systems too. Just the large, when I say that, I'm thinking of, the Midwest really, and how huge those monocultures are, and what is actually really causing it, a huge decline there is just, there is no floral resources in those particular areas for these species to thrive and to survive. And the other thing is climate change. And that's what we're really seeing here in the East Coast, is a really huge change in the climate conditions, particularly in the springtime, where we have a lot of our wild species that are emerging. We're seeing an increase in the extreme weather events. Wind conditions is one of those, and the drastic change in temperatures is something that we're a little bit more acclimatized and used to as maritimers, but wild species are just not used to the drastic change in climate conditions. And the other thing, particularly around Thanksgiving this year, we had very warm weather into the fall, and that was very concerning for me, because a lot of those species should have been in the ground, and they wouldn't have been back in their nest. They would have been out foraging again, because again, their thermal tolerances and their regulations would have told them that it's warm enough, I can continue to go and look for food, when the floral resources just weren't there for particular species. So it's really all four, right? So it's habitat loss, climate change, viral loads, and our agrochemicals. They're being hit by all four of those separately. And there's a lot of interactions that are happening there as well, that we really haven't even touched the surface on yet.
A couple of people also mentioned, wondered if coltsfoot, I've forgotten who it was now, might be an early food source for pollinators.
So I couldn't hear that. What was it?
Coltsfoot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's earlier than the dandelions. Would that be a good source for?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, it would be a really good source.
So I'm kind of curious, where coltsfoot and dandelions are not native species, and yet they seem to be a big part of what they're depending on. What was there before that they were able to evolve to come out that way?
That's a really interesting question, and I guess it depends on where you are. A lot of spring ephemerals are really important species for pollinators, and a lot of species that we're seeing in the understory of forests are very important, and they would be what I would be encouraging to plant. But again, it needs to be baby steps for a lot of individuals out there to go from, asking people not to mow their yards to really, allowing that to be completely natural. It has to be a gradual step if it's going to stay and stick, and really people are going to understand that. So to explain the connection with dandelions is a lot easier for people to really see, because that is something that they can really connect with. But yes, it would be what would be there before would be a lot of spring ephemeral species.
And I think now, thinking about it, the coltsfoot is generally a fair bit ahead of the spring ephemerals that I'm accustomed to, but the spring ephemerals are also in the forest, which is later to warm up. So probably the native bees would emerge later about the time of the ephemerals in the forest because it would be later to warm up. But in the more disturbed areas, which is where the coltsfoot and the dandelion grow, that probably warms up earlier. And so the bees are coming out earlier. So it kind of, that might. All right, the internet just hiccuped again on me. I'm thinking maybe we should call the night here because it does seem to be giving us trouble. How's everybody feel about this?
I'm good. I'm good. I could ask her, could you ask her about the book?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that-
Yeah, Rachel was asking before about, are there any good books about, plants to plant for pollinators or just any of that kind of information that you might recommend?
One specifically, I'm thinking that can help you to identify them.
Well, identify the bees.
Yeah, to identify them.
There is, I think there is a bumblebee book of North America that I would encourage you to get. That's a very good resource. Dr. Sheila Kola is the author of, or one of the authors, I should say, of that book. And that would have a lot of really good information for Canada, particularly Atlantic Canada and the species that we have here. We have a lot of good resources through the Journal of Arthropod Identification. There's a lot of online keys that would have information there. iNaturalist is a great resource for species, and particularly to see the species, the photographs that are associated with it that we have. And Dr. McCorkindale has done a fabulous job of updating it. And I know that there's other experts that really pay attention when individuals post bee photos and they verify the species that are there. So I would encourage you to look at iNaturalist and the bumblebee species that are there. And a lot of the time it's actually better than the book resources, because the individual will identify what the particular insect is on, so what plant species, and that is pretty valuable to know what plant the pollinator is actually visiting and where in the province. So yeah.
Alana, you said Dr. Sheila, what was the last name? Spell it out.
Kola, C-O-L-L-A.
O-L-L. Okay, thank you.
You sort of mentioned honeybees and are, if you like, wild bees, so competing in some ways.
Can you repeat that?
You said that the honeybees were competing with the wild bees.
Yes. So a lot of the times when hives are put into agricultural areas, because they can fly so far, they end up in a natural habitat, and they end up competing with our wild populations for the resources.
Now, I often see honeybees where I am. I'm not close to any real agricultural areas that I know of, but is there I wouldn't call it a native population, but an indigenous population, I don't know what the right word is, but a population of escaped honeybees, I guess? Like how prolific are they in the wild, like as a wild animal,
So they're not wild. They're completely managed, and they're an invasive non-native species.
Oh, really? So they don't farm their, I know when I lived in Ontario, you would find honeybees would make a nest in somebody's wall or something, or in a tree, in empty trees. Is that maybe not so much the case in Nova Scotia?
No, it can happen, but it doesn't happen as much as the news tends to report it. They tend to only report it when they do escape. And that what happens is when a queen is able to move, and a lot of the times the queen, that honeybee, will stay in the hive and be protected. But when she is moved, or when she does escape, and she moves, the whole colony goes with her. That's how social their behavior is. So when she moves, they all tend to move with her. But a lot of the time that doesn't happen. She stays put. And the worker bees are the bees that usually tend to be the ones that are going back and forth, and they take the food resources back to the hive for her. But when it does happen, that's when it tends to be reported on the news that, you know, so-and-so found a population of honeybees in their wall. And that's because the queen actually moved. And it could be because, you know, she felt threatened. There was something that was happening with the hive. You know, it could be just the, you know, movement of the plates itself that could, you know, convince her to move sometimes. But yes, there are no wild, naturally growing populations or sustainable populations of honeybees in Canada. Their common name is the European honeybee, and that's a very different kettle of fish, and they're native to Europe. We brought them over when European settlement happened. That's how the honeybee was established, and we were taking hives back to North America.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I think I'm gonna wrap it up a bit. Well, I just want to thank you very much, Alana. I've learned a lot. And it was very entertaining presentation. I'm hoping my recordings worked out. It kept saying it was recording every time and the internet started out again. So I'm hoping I'll try to edit it together and get it on our website in short order, so that I know some members had already contacted me saying that they weren't going to be able to attend tonight, and we're looking forward to seeing it later. And I think they will enjoy what they see if I can get it together. Anyway, and I'm really sorry that we missed David on this. I think he would have enjoyed it, and we would have enjoyed him as well. So please pass on to him that he was missed.
I will, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.